Please give your perspective on why polyamory is bad for the individual and society. To sleep around casually is to imply that sex is casual. To imply that sex is casual is to assume implicitly that it can be divorced from the rest of life, emotional life, motivational life, values, all of that. And you can divorce it, but you pay a big price for that. I think the price you pay is, the word psychopathic keeps leaping to mind.
They meet across and up dominance hierarchies. And so if you're a male who's successful in a given hierarchy, the probability that you're going to have additional mating opportunities is exceptionally high. It's an unbelievably good predictor of that. Mate choice is a very difficult problem. So how do you solve it? Well, here's how women solve it. Throw them in a ring, let them compete at whatever they're competing at, assume that the man who wins is the best man, marry him. It's a brilliant solution. It's a market-oriented solution. It's actually the solution that appears to have driven our evolutionary departure from chimpanzees. It's a biological solution, but it has a cost. The cost is polygamy. And so we rein that in with enforced monogamy. And we do that in order to provide stable circumstances for children. Societies tilt towards monogamy across the world. It's human universal. Now, that doesn't mean that people don't have polygamous or polyamorous tendencies, because they certainly do. And it's certainly also the case that one of the ways that women gerrymander this system is that, say you're married and you have children with your husband, but you also have an affair. So you have a child by another man. That's more common than anyone suspected. So part of the way that women solve the problem that you're just describing, and I'm not saying anything for this or against this, this is a purely factual biological claim, is they pick a monogamous marriage and they cheat with high status guys. Obviously, in the confines of the marriage, that's a terrible thing. It's common, but it's not the norm. Right? It's still the norm not to do that. The norm is fidelity, but there's plenty of exceptions. Well, enforced monogamy is this. It's like, okay, so my son's getting married in September. And so let's say he comes to me in a year and he says, hey, Dad, guess what? I've had 3 affairs in the last year and they've all been successful. I haven't got caught. Aren't I a good guy? What am I going to say to that? No. What the hell are you doing? That's not what you're supposed to be doing. That's enforced monogamy. Yes, it's built deep into the cultural norms. And if that starts to destabilize, then there's trouble. And that doesn't mean that it's not prone to all the problems that you laid out. Look, there isn't a bigger problem than successful reproduction. It is the big problem. And all of the solutions that we've generated for it are full of flaws. Like, here's an example. The gender pay gap. Okay, there's no gender pay gap. There's a mother gap. There's other reasons too, but women really take a hit when they become mothers. Okay, that's unfair. Fair enough, man. What the hell are you going to do? Polygamous societies tend to become ultra-violent. Yeah. And that's been known in the anthropological literature for 100 years. And certainly leftist anthropologists were among those who discovered it. Like, the journalist knew perfectly well what I meant by enforced monogamy. It was also 2 minutes out of a 2-day conversation. Yes. That was funny in some sense, because my sense is if you want to pillory someone, you should attribute to them views that someone somewhere has had. And the implication of that part of the New York Times article was that I wanted to... one of the things I've said continually, and this is on record in multiple places, it's like, okay, so you're a young man, and all the women are rejecting you. Who's got the problem? It's not all the women. That's a bad road to go down. If all the women are rejecting you, it's you. It's the solution to the relationship between men and women. Is if a polygamous society develops, which is the alternative, then a small minority of men get all the women. That's what happened. One of the ways that societies around the world have figured out that you keep young male aggression under control is by enforcing monogamous standards, because it gives everyone a chance in some sense. Well, you see this happening in universities where women outnumber men. So the men hypothetically have more sexual opportunity, but that isn't what happens. What happens is that a small minority of men have all the sexual opportunity. A fairly large minority of men don't. The women are unhappy because they can't find a committed relationship. It's bad for most of the men. To give the journalist credit, that is the point she was making. Apart from pillaring me and caricaturing my perspective, that was the point she was making. Well, first of all, I'm not in favor of unbridled hierarchies. The proclivity of a hierarchy is that all the spoils go to the person at the top, and that can destabilize the whole structure. Yes. So we have to have a dialogue about how to rectify that. And that the problem with hierarchies is that they can get too steep and destabilize everything. That does happen. That particularly happens in the sexual domain. There's plenty of anthropological evidence for that. But you still might say, well, who cares? Because the men who are winning should be allowed to win and the women should be allowed to choose. It's like, yes, except that there's the problem of children. And so society steps in on behalf of the children. And you can say, well, lots of people don't want to have children. Yes, and that's truer now than it used to be, although many of those people end up having children anyways, the guys who are sleeping around all the time, so that doesn't circumvent the problem. But the issue here for me isn't the men or the women, it's the children. And we're trying to set up societies where the probability that children will be raised in something approximated an optimal environment is optimized. And that's going to mean sacrifice of opportunity and choice on the part of adults.
Please give your perspective on why polyamory is bad for the individual and society. Well, I think there's a bunch of reasons. I mean, the first is societies seem to function better, that is, less violently, let's say, when there's one woman per man. If there's many women per man, there aren't many women for every man. There are a handful of men, let's say a minority of men, a Pareto distribution of men who have a disproportionate number of women, and a lot of men who have none. And those aren't happy men, let's put it that way. They're men who are very likely to get up to no good very rapidly. So there's that. Let's say a man has many women, and let's say he's a desirable man for that matter, just for the sake of argument. If he has a variety of women, then those women don't have much of him. So they don't get to establish a real individual relationship with him because it's going to be fragmentary. And I don't believe that that's satisfying for people. I think that what you want, as much as you possibly can, is to have people around you with whom you can weave your life together over the short term, medium term, and long term. It adds depth to your life in a way that almost nothing else can. And so I've been speaking more about permanent polyamorous relationships. You might ask, well, what about sequential ones, which is in some ways indiscriminable from just casual sleeping around? I think the problem with that is that to sleep around casually is to imply that sex is casual. To imply that sex is casual is to assume implicitly that it can be divorced from the rest of life, emotional life, motivational life, values, all of that. And you can divorce it, but you pay a big price for that. The price you pay is the word psychopathic keeps leaping to mind. You have to reduce a person to the casual pleasure of a transient sexual interaction in order to sleep around casually. And I think that once you establish that as a habit with sex, which is a deep experience, if you'll do that with sex, which is a deep experience, then, and you learn how, then what makes you think that won't transfer to everything else that you do? I don't see how it can fail to. So you could say, well, monogamy isn't a very good solution. It's like, well, life is a fatal, sexually transmitted disease with a 100% fatality rate too. Well, there's lots of really complex problems for which we only have the best answer we can come up with, which is not utopian answer. And I think the evidence supports this as well, that stable monogamy is the best solution that we know of. And it's also the minimum necessary requirement for the stability of children.